High over the frozen landscape of northern Germany, 4 American pilots were trapped. Behind them, closing at terrifying speed, were the sharp-nosed silhouettes of at least 20 German BF-109s. The mathematics of aerial combat were brutally simple. They were outnumbered 5-1. Their fuel gauges were dipping into the red. To fight was to die. To run was impossible. Their commander had one desperate, unprecedented order. Don't engage. Don't dive. Outrun them. This is the story of a single, audacious mission on March 4, 1944. A mission where 4 North American P-51B Mustangs of the 357th Fighter Group, nicknamed the Yoxford Boys, were tasked not with destroying the Luftwaffe in a dogfight, but with humiliating it in a race. Their goal was to shatter a psychological barrier, to prove the Luftwaffe could no longer defend its own capital. This is how 4 Mustangs outran 2109s, and in doing so, broke the Reich's back. To understand the sheer audacity of this mission, we must go back to the dark days of 1943. The combined bomber offensive was bleeding itself white over Europe. Unescorted B-17 and B-24 heavy bombers, flying deep into Germany, were being slaughtered by German interceptors. Loss rates of 20, even 25%, were not uncommon. A mission was considered a success if you lost less than 5% of your force. The math was unsustainable. The air war was failing. The men of the 8th Air Force called it the bloody business. The problem was one of physics and fuel. Allied fighters like the robust P-47 Thunderbolt and the agile Spitfire simply could not carry enough fuel to follow the bombers all the way to distant targets like Berlin, Schweinfurt, or Regensburg. They'd reach their point of no return, a geographical limit marked on maps, and be forced to turn back. For the bomber crews, watching those friendly fighters peel away was a moment of profound dread. Ahead lay hundreds of miles of unprotected sky, known as the Gauntlet, where the Luftwaffe's fighters waited. Enter the North American P-51 Mustang. Initially designed for the British with an underwhelming Allison engine, it was a good low-altitude aircraft, but nothing extraordinary. It was, in the words of one early report, useful, but not revolutionary. Then, in a stroke of genius, engineers at North American and Rolls-Royce married the Mustang's revolutionary, low-drag laminar flow wing to the British Merlin 61 engine. The result was a transformation. The P-51B, with its 2-stage supercharger, didn't just fly, it soared. It possessed a top speed over 440 miles per hour and, most crucially, an endurance of over 6 hours with external fuel tanks. By early 1944, these new Mustangs were arriving in England. Their pilots were young men, like Captain Donald R. Buck Bouchard of the 364th Fighter Squadron, 357th Group. They were told they had a new airplane, one that could change everything. Their first job was to learn it. Their second job, they soon learned, was to prove a point not just to the Luftwaffe, but to their own high command. The point was this: nowhere in Germany was safe anymore. The target for March 4, 1944, was Berlin. Big B. The heart of the Nazi beast. For the first time in the war, the USAF was sending a full force of bombers, over 500 strong, to pound the capital in daylight. And for the first time, a significant portion of them would have fighter escort all the way to the target and back. The 357th Fighter Group was part of that pioneering shield. The mission profile was grueling. Takeoff from their base at RAF Leiston in the frosty English dawn. Rendezvous with the bomber stream over the North Sea. Then, the long, tense overland flight across the Dutch coast, into the flak corridors of the Ruhr, and finally, the long sprint to Berlin itself. The Mustangs flew high, often above 30,000 feet, where the air was thin and bitterly cold, minus 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Pilots wore electrically heated suits, but a failure could mean frostbite in minutes. Captain Bouchard led his flight of 4 P-51Bs, call sign Sunflower, as part of the group's forward sweep. Their job was not to stick close to the bombers, but to range ahead, to clear the sky of German interceptors before they could form up for an attack. It was an aggressive, dangerous tactic called fighter sweep. They were the bait and the hunters, all in one. By 1300 hours, the vast armada was crossing into Germany. The first radio calls crackled over the VHF sets. Bandits, 10 o'clock high. Many bogies, vectoring north. The Luftwaffe was rising to meet them. Initially, engagements were scattered. A few Focke-Wulf 190s would make slashing attacks on the bomber boxes, only to be chased away by the vigilant Mustangs. The 357th scored several kills that afternoon. But the German strategy was evolving. They knew the Mustangs had limited time on station. They began holding their main fighter forces back, waiting for the escorts to reach their operational limits. As Sunflower Flight approached the initial point for the bomb run, just west of Berlin, the sky was a chaotic mural of contrails, flak bursts, and burning aircraft. Below, the city was obscured by a vast carpet of smoke. It was then, at precisely 1415 hours, that Bouchard's wingman, Lieutenant James, Jr. H. Smith, made the call that turned their mission from offensive to desperate. Lead, Sunflower 2. Look at our 6, high. We've got company. A lot of it. Bouchard craned his neck. High above and behind them, catching the afternoon sun, was a swarm of aircraft. They were too far for positive identification, but the profile was unmistakable, the angular wings and rounded vertical stabilizers of Messerschmitt BF-109G 6S. And they weren't just a squadron. As the pilots counted, the number grew. 8, 12, 16, 20. Possibly more. They were stacked in layers, a Grupp-sized force, diving to gain speed for an intercept. Their trajectory placed them perfectly to pounce on the withdrawing bomber stream, which was now turning for its long, vulnerable journey home. The instinct of every fighter pilot is to turn into the threat. To climb, to fight, to break up the enemy formation. Bouchard's 4 Mustangs were in a superior position to intercept. But he did the math. 4 versus 20. Even if they took down 2 or 3 each, which was optimistic, they would be overwhelmed. The remaining 109s would then be free to savage the unescorted bombers. His flight would be a footnote, a heroic but futile sacrifice. At that moment, Bouchard remembered a briefing. A technical briefing about the new Mustang's performance envelope. The BF-109G, laden with extra armor, heavier cannon, and often an underbelly-drop tank or bomb, was a powerful but draggy aircraft. Above 25,000 feet, the Mustang B, clean, having long since jettisoned its external fuel tanks, had a slight but critical advantage in top speed. It wasn't much. Perhaps 10, 15 miles per hour. But in a straight line, it was everything. Bouchard keyed his mic, his voice calm but firm. Sunflower Flight, lead. Do not, repeat, do not break. Do not engage. We are going to lead them on a merry chase. Maintain course. Full military power. Now. For throttle levers were pushed forward, through the gate into war emergency power. The Merlin engines, already screaming, reached a new, deafening crescendo. The Mustangs began to accelerate, not away from the bombers, but parallel to them, as if unaware of the descending wolf pack. For the next 90 seconds, it was a game of predatory psychology. The German formation, led by an experienced Staffelkapitän, saw the 4 lone Mustangs. They were a tempting, isolated target. The logical move for the 109s was to finish their dive, level out, and pursue. And that is exactly what they did. What happened next was not a dogfight. It was an aerial pursuit that would test machines, men, and nerves to their absolute limits. The 20 BF-109s merged into a loose, deadly queue behind the 4 American fighters. The distance began to close. From 8 miles, to 5, to 3. In their rearview mirrors, the American pilots could now see the distinct yellow noses of the enemy aircraft, the black crosses growing larger, more defined. Tracers began to arc through the sky, not accurate fire, but ranging shots. The message was clear: we have you in our sights. Fear is a physical force in a cockpit at 30,000 feet. It tightens the stomach, clouds the vision, screams in the ear to do something. To turn, to roll, to jink. But Bouchard's order held. Maintain course. They were flying straight and level, presenting the most predictable target imaginable. It felt like suicide. Lieutenant Smith later recalled the sensation: it was like running down a long, straight alley with 20 men with rifles behind you. Every second, you expected the impact. The crisis deepened with every passing mile. They were now deep over eastern Germany, burning fuel at an astronomical rate. The fuel gauge on Bouchard's instrument panel was the true enemy. The needle was falling toward the reserve mark. They had been at war emergency power for minutes. The engines could only take that strain for a short time before risking catastrophic failure. Behind them, the 109s were still there, stubbornly clinging on. The speed differential was marginal. A slight miscalculation, a patch of turbulence that slowed one Mustang by a few knots, and the pack would be on them. Then, the first real shots hit. A cannon shell from a leading 109 exploded just off Sunflower 3's right wingtip, shattering the comm with a burst of orange flame and shrapnel. The Mustang shuddered violently but held formation. A piece of flak? No. This was targeted fire. The Germans were now in effective range. The window of survival was slamming shut. Bouchard faced an impossible decision. If he broke now, the 109s would be upon them in the turn, and the race would be over in a swirling, violent dogfight they could not win. If he continued, they would be picked off one by one in a straight line. The sheer weight of numbers was about to tell. He glanced at the compass. They were leading the Germans away from the bombers, but also away from their own safe exit route. They were being herded, played. The triumph of the Mustang's speed was proving to be a phantom. It was a matter of seconds now. Narrator, and then, the laws of physics and logistics intervened. Unseen by the American pilots, in the cockpits of the pursuing BF-109s, a different kind of crisis was unfolding. The German fighters had been scrambled in haste to intercept the Berlin raid. Many had not had time to fully fuel. They had been holding at altitude, burning fuel, before engaging. Now, in this prolonged, high-power, low-altitude chase, their own fuel gauges were plummeting. The Messerschmitts were also operating at the very edge of their endurance. Furthermore, the clean, aerodynamically superior Mustangs were performing exactly as the designers had hoped. As the chase dragged on past the 5-minute mark, the slight speed advantage began to compound. In Bouchard's mirror, the image shifted. The lead 109s were no longer gaining. They were holding steady. Then, imperceptibly at first, they began to fall back. A gap of 800 yards became 1,000. Then 1,500. It wasn't a dramatic burst of speed from the Mustangs, it was a gradual, undeniable stretching of the distance. The German flight leader faced his own grim calculus. He was being led on a wild goose chase, away from the primary target, the bombers. His fuel warning lights were beginning to glow. To continue this futile pursuit meant risking a forced landing in a field or capture. With a fury born of frustration, he keyed his own radio. Schluss machen. Zurück zur Basis. Break it off. Return to base. One by one, the 20 BF-109s broke their pursuit. They peeled away to the left and right, climbing slowly, conservatively, to preserve their dwindling fuel for the trip back to their own airfields. The sky behind Sunflower Flight was suddenly, stunningly, empty. But the mission was not over. Bouchard and his men were now alone, deep in hostile territory, with critically low fuel. They had won the race, but they still had to win the journey home. They turned west, climbing back to a more fuel-efficient altitude, their engines throttled back to a cruise setting that felt agonizingly slow. Every minute over Germany was a minute in the lion's den. They skirted known flak areas, their eyes scanning the empty sky, not in relief, but in new tension. Would the 109s refuel and come back? Had they been a diversion for another group? The silence on the radio was deafening. Then, the voice of the bomber controller crackled through. All escort units, be advised. Withdrawing bomber stream reports light to no fighter interception east of the Rhine. Good work, little friends. That was the confirmation. By leading that entire group of interceptors on a futile chase, Sunflower Flight had effectively neutralized them. 20 fighters that should have been tearing into the B-17s had instead wasted their fuel and ammunition chasing 4 ghosts. The bombers had made their turn largely unmolested. The Mustang's true weapon that day was not its .50 caliber machine guns, but its endurance and its speed, used not to kill, but to deceive, to exhaust, to humiliate. Sunflower Flight made it back to RAF Leiston on vapors. Their landing was a quiet affair, the long mission having drained them of adrenaline, leaving only a deep, weary hollow. They filed their mission report, noting the sighting and evasion of 20+ E/A enemy aircraft. It was logged as an uneventful sortie, no kills, no losses. On paper, it was a non-event. But word spread through the pilot-ready rooms of the 8th Air Force. The story of the 4 Mustangs who outran 2,109s became a legend, a proof of concept. It proved the Mustang could not only reach Berlin, but it could dominate the sky around it through sheer performance. It could force the Luftwaffe onto the defensive, to react rather than act. The strategic impact was monumental. March 4, 1944, was a prelude. 4 days later, on March 8, the 8th Air Force returned to Berlin in force. And again, and again. The Luftwaffe was forced to fight on American terms, at altitudes and over distances that favored the P-51. Pilot morale in the Jagdverband began to crack. One captured German pilot famously lamented, "When I saw the Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the war was lost." The Mustang, specifically in its role as a long-range escort, broke the back of the Luftwaffe's day fighter force. It enabled the destruction of the German oil infrastructure and transportation networks in 1944, which crippled the Wehrmacht on all fronts. While countless units and pilots contributed to this victory, missions like that of Sunflower Flight on March 4 were the turning point. They demonstrated a new, terrifying reality for the Reich: there was no sanctuary. The skies over the fatherland itself belonged to the enemy. Captain Donald Bouchard and each member of his flight were later awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for their role in this and other missions. But their true legacy was not a medal. It was the thousands of bomber crewmen who made it home because the Mustangs were there, ensuring that the gauntlet to Berlin was finally, irrevocably, closed. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. A story not of a famous battle, but of a critical moment in a cold sky that shifted the balance of an entire campaign. Subscribe to our channel as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.